thank you very much, and I quite appreciate the invitation to come and speak to you today, although, you know, when you're dealing with the 13th century BC, you think in large, ambitious terms. I'm going to be much more humble in my approach to trying to understand a crisis. And I never quite know how to begin these, so we'll be moving over to Mesopotamia proper. Can I get the mouse? Yeah, so of course you can see it there. Yeah. So this part of the world here, line drawing obviously done there. I think we all know this. And I'll be looking at the Aena Temple of Uruk, and I put this slide up only because it's the closest artist rendition to what I think it looked like, with this huge temple complex in the middle of a densely packed city, and we'll be speaking specifically about the Aena Temple down in the city of Uruk there. And my main aim is to make two arguments. The first of them will be that an unusual set of demands on the temple economy coming during a time of a harsh economic climate will make demands on the temple's system of livestock management that will reverberate for about 18 months later, will play out for the next 18 months. And these will start in Cambyses year 2 and then go into years 3 and 4. So I'm going to argue, first of all, that we can see something approaching a crisis playing out in the documentation. And then I'll sort of argue the reverse of that. I'll argue that we can see the institutional controls at work as the temple starts to come to terms with this crisis and work around it. And hopefully you'll find it convincing. So I'll give you some sources to think about. So again, we're at the beginning of the Cambyses year, so we'll be in the late 520s as we talk about this. And then I think the best way to understand the temple is something like a flow chart, and hopefully you can see the words on the slide. Most of my book is on the relationship between the Aena's livestock contractors and the temple itself, right? You need to sort of separate those two out because it's really fascinating. But the long and the short of it is this: these livestock contractors held the Aena's animals on contract, and we have very good sources to show that in any given year they had control over 70 to 90,000 animals, and they were all throughout Mesopotamia at pasture. And the terms of the contract were such that these contractors brought lambs and wool to the temple. And again, we can go into this if people have questions. More or less, I've discovered that from these contractors, each year the temple took about 20% of their lambs, of their young male lambs, for sacrifice, right? The contractors kept a few males around for studding, for impregnating the females. And more or less, the temple took all the wool, right? So all the wool, about 20% of the male lambs. And so the interests of the contractors were that they sold off the rest of the male lambs for meat, right? And then they also had control over the dairy products of the male lambs. And so the contractors themselves, they kept the female lambs in the herd because they reproduced themselves. Those female lambs were branded with the temple brand, so they were immediately under temple protection. The temple could send people to arrest people who stole the lambs and that sort of thing. And I also argue that the temple acted as a kind of insurance. So if you had an epidemic, you can come back to the temple and get others. There's a lot more that needs explanation here, but it's not part of the larger point. So again, I'm happy to come back to it a bit later. My interest here is the bringing of male lambs into the temple. And what I discovered, and what was really instrumental in making the points that I wanted to make, is that we have a lot of sources where we can tell the local storage that the temple had in Uruk. That is, how many lambs they could bring in and feed and just hold locally. And that number is about 1,200, right? So locally, in the city itself, the temple could store about 1,200 lambs. But the temple needed about 4,300 for the entire year for its sacrifices, right? So it could only hold about 1/3, 1/4 of its storage locally. Therefore, the point I make in the slide here is important, that the system was always in operation, right? There was a big collection around the time of the shearing, and then the contractors were consistently paying animals back into the temple, a little at a time, right? And the temple would take the animals in, and then it would fatten them up over a period of 2 or 3 months. And when it fattened them up is where you see the fork in the road, right? Because it gave them to one of two places. It either put them under the control of what it called the offering shepherd, right? And he seems to have been in control of a type of specialized fattening of the lambs. He may have fed them milk, which gives a particular kind of meat when they're sacrificed, something like veal. So that's one branch of where the animals went. And then another branch, and these were slightly more than half would go to the second branch, went to what I'm calling here the general stables for fattening. And I call them the general stables because the general stables, they dealt with cattle, they dealt with birds, and they also dealt with sheep. And so there were all sorts of animals can go there, and that's not the case with the offering shepherd. He only dealt with lambs. And the general stables were also in charge of fattening. We have texts that have employees called sheep fatteners and so on. Right? So they fattened the animals up in these two branches, and then you see the last part of the flow chart. They released them from these branches according to a schedule, and I'll show you the schedule coming up. And then they made their way to what I'm calling the sacrificial table. That is, they were sacrificed at the temple through a very sophisticated system, and then their meat was dispersed out to temple personnel. And as you see, at the minimum, every day the offering shepherd gave 4 animals, and then the general stables gave 5. And that's at least. That's the minimum every day. Some days for festivals, they would give 90 in one day. Right? And this system, again, was constantly in operation, and we actually know that the system worked the way it should, with one exception. That's the exception we're going to talk about, for a 26-year period. Normally, with cuneiform text, you see a little bit here, a little bit there, and it's frustrating. But we can actually say that the system worked for 26 years because we have what are referred to as tabular sacrifice records. And I point to the arrow there because they document that part of the transaction. That is, that's what they're documenting, is the 2 animals coming out and then making their way to the sacrificial table. Let me see what's next. So here's an image of a tabular sacrifice text, just so you can see it. And you have the date formula at the top. So this will be of a particular month, of a particular year. So say this is the 4th year of Cambyses year, the 4th month of Cambyses year 5. And then down the side, you have the days of the month. So day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then in these 2 columns, and sometimes there's more, but that's not important for us, we have the number of lambs coming out of each area. So one of them, this is the general stables, and these are the lambs coming out of, the offering shepherd. And it's a wonderful text when you have a whole bunch of them, because you can begin to reconstruct the entire sacrificial system. You know how many lambs they needed throughout the year, you know when the offerings went up, and so on. And so this is a chart, and this is obviously difficult to see, but this is sort of the point, this is from my book. You can reconstruct the sacrificial system of how many lambs were used each day. And so what you see down this side are the days of the month. That's not right. The days of the month, where is my cursor? This way. These are the months up here. And then you see the number of lambs that were sacrificed on every single day. So, for example, in the beginning of month 12, the first couple days, they went sacrifice crazy, right? 15 on the first day, 71 on the second day, 95 on the second. And what's nice is we have overlapping results. So, for example, we'll have month 4 attested in 4 different years, right? And they line up perfectly. It's really, really an interesting text, and they work all the time. There are some exceptions, but there are one or two numbers. But there are some anomalies, and that's what the crisis I'm going to talk about here. And the anomalies are actually the first part of your handout. At the top, you see Cambyses years 2, 3, and 4, and then you see the percentage of lambs that the offering shepherd gave for sacrifice as a percentage of what he would normally give on those months, in those months, right? And so you see in 3 and 4, he's either giving nothing, which is really unusual. He's delivering in year 3 at maybe a quarter of his usual amount. And then in year 4 is not as well attested. He's at 3/4 of his usual amount, and then by the end of year 4, he's back at 100%, right? And this is the type of text, as was done in the original publication by these, where you point it out, you say that's interesting, and then you go on to the next thing, right? Because what can you do in isolation with this information? What I want to argue is that we can actually link up the problems that you see in the offering shepherds not contributing with other texts, and these all relate back to a bigger crisis. But I do want to make this point that, and I make the point at the end of that first part there, that even though the offering shepherd's not contributing, the temple is still hitting the right numbers, right? It's just the difference is coming out of the general stables. So the general stables is essentially giving double what it would normally give during this time, which makes it, I think, even more interesting. So the question would be, what brought about this anomaly? And again, I would say two things. Number one, we know of very rough economic conditions during these years, Cambyses 2, 3, and 4. Kristen Klaber has published on this, and these are very bad barley harvests. But more importantly for us, and I think there's a debate over how to say which one had more influence over this. More importantly for us, what we do know is right towards the end of Cambyses year 2, the king himself, the king of the world, Cambyses, held a royal banquet near Uruk. And these are famous texts. They've been known for a while. But these texts drew from the Eanna's economy, especially in animals, right? Now, I want to make a few points before we get more specific about it. Number one, and I need to stress this, it was very, very, very unusual for the crown to make demands on the Eanna's animals, right? So these demands, which we're going to get into, are not more of the same. They're really, really unusual, if not unprecedented, right? And secondly, and I'll just sort of make this point, is not only is it unprecedented for the crown to demand the temple's animals, in fact, what we do find is, so what you're seeing here is the chart of the point I'm trying to make here, that all of the animals in Cambyses year 3 were coming from the general stables and were not coming from the offering shepherd, just to put it visually. Now, the one point I'll make, and I won't make a big deal of this, but it's important to know, is in fact, not only does the crown not normally take animals from the temple, it actually supplied them. And it actually supplied about 20% of the animals that made their way to the sacrificial table per year. So it's that unusual, what we're about to get into here. And this is the second part of your handout. And this, again, these texts are very well known. They've been published and talked about since the 1930s. I just want to tie them in a little more specifically to what I'm going to talk about. And what I know about the animal economy, there were 3 texts, and you see the numbers there. The authority who's mentioned, and then the demand on the temple economy. And I'll take them one by one just to make some points here. In the first one, they demand 80 fattened udunita. And udunita can mean either sheep or goats or sheep and goats, which is why I'm using the German here, because we don't use the word small cattle in English, but nonetheless, I think you know what I'm driving at. The trouble is that when you read the text, they're taking the animals out of the general stables. So they're taking them out of the Eanna's storage, and the Eanna doesn't deal with goats. So this must mean sheep here, right? And so they're taking 80 fully fattened sheep, which normally would be given to Ishtar, right? So this is quite a demand that they are making. The second order is odd in another way, in the sense that it's an order for adult female sheep, ewes, as you see there. That just doesn't happen, right? The Eanna doesn't keep ewes in its internal storage, and so that order is affecting directly the livestock contractors, right? Not only in the sense is it taking the most expensive animal out of the herd, it's the one that reproduces itself, and we know that these are fertile because they're lactating. It's also taking dairy, which is under the domain of the contractors themselves. And so it's a demand on the contractors to supply the animals, which normally supply the personal wealth, the reason why they're contracting with the temple for them. And again, there's only a few references to dairy. I mean, it was personal for the contractors. And it's unique in another way, but it's unique in the problematic way that cuneiform text can be. And that is right around the time that these orders are coming in. It's about a month before the order themselves. We have another unique text from the Eanna archive. And the text seems to detail an incident that's not related to this, at least not at first. And this is a time, and we have texts like this all the time, but the ending of this one is unique. And this is when a temple dependent comes in and he slaughters one of the ewes of a contractor, right? And the contractor does what he's supposed to do, and he goes to temple authorities and he lodges a complaint, right, that this guy came and killed one of his sheep. And in describing what happened when this guy came and slaughtered his ewe, all we have are debates over what the meaning of the text is. And so I put up 3 of the most recent translations of this, and you can kind of make of it what you will. I can't solve the philological problems, and the 3 people up here are much better at this than I am. So you can see what they're saying. Some of them miss the point that it's a ewe, but nonetheless, they get the point that while he's being called out for slaughtering an animal, the slaughterer, the thief, the guy who took the wrong text, makes this allusion to the 2 Persian administrators who right at this time are demanding ewes from the temple, and he makes some sort of demand that says, this is like what they're doing to us, right? Where they're grabbing us by the throat, according to one translation, right? Or they're putting chains around our neck or something to that effect, right? It's fascinating, and again, it's one of these very cuneiform things where you want to make all these connections, but they don't quite work. I just throw it out there to add some color, because we don't get a lot of political subversion in our texts, right? And this seems to be a case where somebody is, right when these orders are coming in, calling out the Persian administrators for their demands in these animals, which is very unusual. In the third order, I would just point out that goats are generally peripheral to the Eanna's economy. They kept a few around. The Eanna itself doesn't keep goats internally, and so this is a demand that comes again on the contractors. And so this banquet, this table of the king, which has been so much good literature on the political importance of it and so on, happens in the 8th month of Cambyses' year 2. And we can say for certain, although it's impossible to quantify, that we have a set of unusual demands on the temple's economy right at that point. Right? Now we'll sort of switch back and look what happens in the temple itself. Right? We'll see that as the temple goes into sort of crisis mode here. And again, we have a variety of evidence. I'm not going to get into it here, that the temple had in its internal storage, enough animals to meet the demands of the sacrificial requirements right at the time of the banquet. And we actually have a tabular sacrifice text. I have it highlighted for Cambyses' year 2, right in that month, when they met their sacrificial demands without any problems, without any issues. But right after the banquet, we see a very unusual set of texts start to be generated among the temple authorities. And so text number 3 that you looked at with the order for goats has 2 parts. And the first part you see, it's an open order. It just says you need to give goats for the royal banquet. And then there's a second obligation for that same herdsman there. And you can read through it. I don't think I need to read it. But essentially, he's obligated twice, right? He has an open order to give goats for the royal administration. And then this same person, it says, again, an open order, right? Has to pay sacrificial lambs to the Lady of Uruk for this particular month, right? If not, there's a punishment. And it's rather strange, and it's strange for a bunch of reasons. The first reason is that we just don't have many contracts of this sort between the temple and its suppliers. I mean, we can trace them for 150 years, but they rarely draw up a specific contract to bring in animals. It was a much less regulated written documentation. I used to argue in my dissertation I did, for example, that contracts like this were the norm until I realized they all group up in this area, right in this time. And so, in fact, it's just anomalous to put a herder under contract to bring it in. So, number 1, turning to written documentation is interesting. And number 2, I would say it's unusual because the contract is open-ended, right? It doesn't say a number of animals that he has to bring in. In fact, both obligations here are open-ended. And so the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to have an open-ended order, right? Does it mean the temple can take as many as it wants and they just have to pay, and so on? And that question, I think, gets answered when we look at the next text that's generated in this time of crisis, right? And this is the next one on the list. And again, it's very similar to the first one, saying he must bring in lambs. But then the part in bold is really interesting. And it says he takes responsibility for the regular offerings of the Lady of Uruk. If there's a mistake, if there's a problem, he will bear the punishment of the king. And why that's interesting, why that clause is interesting, is because it normally occurs in texts that are concerned with this step right here, right? Not only with the animals, but with anything that's making its way into the high-level prebendary system of the temple. And so, for example, Dr. Caroline Varsegers has shown, the timing of the offerings, getting everything there on time is so sophisticated, so incredibly complex, that one misstep can throw the whole system into disarray, right? And so what they're essentially doing here with these contracts is lining up the deliveries by the external management with the demands of the sacrificial table, and they're skipping that middle step, right? So again, normally they would bring in the animals, they would hold them locally for 2 months, they would fatten them up. You could get the timing down because you're using them for, fattening them for 2 months, and then bringing them to sacrifice. But by linking up and missing that crucial step, I think we see how the temple is starting to deal with the unusual demands on its local storage. Right? Now, we lose track of the system. I'll come back to this slide. We lose track of the system for a few months, and then we can pick it up in year 3 of Cambyses, which is the heart of the crisis. And we can see that the Aeana is again struggling with its internal storage, because we can go back up to the beginning of the handout, and this is where the tabular sacrifice texts are interesting. And what you see in year 3, for the months that are attested, the offering shepherd does not contribute to this system for 4 of the 6 months that we have attestations for, right? He makes no deliveries for the only time in the 26-year record he's not contributing at all for 2 months in a row. He makes significantly fewer towards the end, for the middle part, and then in the end, he's making none again. Now again, I wish I knew exactly what the offering shepherd did. That might help quite a bit here. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these texts show that there is a problem with his stock, right? And the temple is forced essentially to turn to what they're calling the general stables in order to make up the difference. And what I'm guessing is happening is that, as you see on the slide behind me here, is that there is now this direct connection between the suppliers and the sacrificial table because the internal stock of the temple had been depleted. It just isn't there. And so the only way the temple knows how to sort of mark this as happening is to link them up as going through the general stables, right? And in fact, we can actually document this offering shepherd's little uptick of offerings in months 5 and 6 with another text. And this is the graph that's the third part, the table that's the third part of the thing. And it's YOS 743. We don't need to get into the details here, but it talks about all the animals that are collected. And it has 779. And you see, and you can compare it to the same type of text from the year before, right? And you see in the year before that that they just essentially split the animals in half. The offering shepherd got half. The fattening stable, the general stables got half. And then in year 3, the heart of the crisis, they have a bigger number of animals coming in, but they don't split them evenly. The offering shepherd doesn't get many. He gets 12% of them. And then you can see he adds, again, this corresponds perfectly with months 4 and 5 when he has a few animals back. And then he's out again. And it goes on. So I would argue then what we're getting here is a glimpse in how a sort of atypically large and atypically centralized institution reacts to unusual stresses on its economy. We see it takes it in 2 steps, right? On the one hand, it draws up formal legal recognition from its outside contractors for a transaction that before that was usually not documented, right? So it's putting pressure on tightening institutional controls over its outside contractors in order to keep the system working. And then internally, it's reprioritizing its stock, right? It's limiting the number of animals that's going into one of its specialized feeders in order to make sure that maybe one of its more utilitarian stockhouse was full. And it doesn't end there. And I know I have to go a little quickly here. We have more texts that date to Cambyses year 3 right around this time. And the next 2 of them, one of them is a summary, and the other one is a translation. And again, these are texts that for years I just read, and I said, well, that's an interesting text. Here's a contract to draw up hides. I guess the Ayana had a need for sheep hides. And as I got more control over the archive, as I understood things better, I realized that these are really some of the only references to the delivery of hides that we have. And what sort of tipped the scales for me to understand these as a crisis was the word in the second one in BM 113415 for losses, which is dictu. And this is a word that they use in the contracts when they give out herds that means allowable losses. You're allowed 10% of your herd to die each year, right? But they never prove it in the text, and now they're being forced to prove that their animals are dying, right? And so what I would argue is happening here is that the temple is, again, putting more pressure on its contractors, again, to a system that normally operated maybe through trust or whatever it might be, is now being drawn up into contracts, and the temple is calling in their accounts and in some ways liquidating their herds, right? Putting more pressure on them to bring in more animals. Another text, and this is the second to the last one, is written in Cambyses year 3. And they are putting, these are also the people who have to prove their losses, they are putting an unusually high demand of animals on them. This is the second largest demand in animals from contractors that I am aware of, right? The first largest is the last text on that list, which I will get to. And again, if you link up, it depends on how you count it, but if you link up this demand with animals for the number that needed to be sacrificed, they are taking 1/4 or 1/2 of the number that they needed in animals from that one group of herdsmen, right? So they're leaning on particular herdsmen to, again, prove losses, deliver massive numbers of animals. So, as I read the text, they can keep the system stable, right? They can keep their animals coming in for sacrifice. And then again, there's the last text written in Cambyses year 3, and this is by far the largest number of animals that I know of demanded from herdsmen, right? And again, normally when we have administrative text, the herdsmen give 15 or 20, and a whole bunch of them give 15 or 20 in a month to keep the system going, right? And here we see, again, this huge number of animals that are required. It's 50 more than the total sacrifices that are needed for that particular month, right? So they're trying to link up the need for sacrifices with one herdsman to bring them in. So let me summarize this. Oh, and then I would point out, Cambyses year 4 back at the top. Not very well attested, but the 1 month we have, he's still not giving his animals at the number he usually does. And then by the end of that year, he's back to full capacity, as you see. So here's how I would reconstruct these years. In Cambyses year 2, Ayana authorities were first dealing with some underachieving harvests. So they were also obligated to supply this royal banquet. The banquet itself puts pressure both on the contractors and on the Ayana's internal supply. We also have that interesting text that shows there was some grumbling about it. Right? Not only did these demands really hurt Ayana's local storage, they put stress on the relationship between them and their contractors, who were forced to pay into this system or forced to give up more lambs than they normally would. In turn, this caused the Ayana's authorities to do two things. Number one, to tighten institutional controls by putting new, extraordinary demands on their contractors and also putting their demands in writing. I mean, just the fact we have texts, I think, is part of the institutional controls that are being used. These texts now with witnesses and due dates and obligations that had to be met. And then we can sort of chart it out. The first of these are going to be open-ended, right? They're essentially going to say, we need as many lambs as we can take from you in order to get control over a system that's in disarray, that's falling apart. As they get into year 3, they tighten the controls even more. They start to call in accounts of the herdsmen. They make them bring in specific numbers of animals, which may indicate that they're gaining control over their stock because they now know what they need rather than just demanding large numbers of animals. Maybe they're getting control over their planning. And at the same time, I'm guessing that because of the bad harvests, they don't want to keep the animals in storage for as long because we know that barley supplies were short. And so they're bringing animals in, making this connection more explicit, and maybe taking pressure off the barley stock so they can use to feed their dependents and so on. By year 4, the pressure's off, but it's not completely off. We have another set of legal texts, which I don't have time to get into, but we also have the evidence that the offering shepherd was not yet working at full capacity. He's at a higher rate than the previous year, but not before. So again, to sum up, I would argue that what we're looking at here is evidence for how the Ayana Temple, a large, complex institution, dealt with a crisis, right? Extraordinary demands, bad economic climate, forced the temple to tighten institutional controls, reallocate some of its stock, in order to keep the system moving by the schedule that they knew. And what's most interesting to me is that it took 18 months to recover, right? A short-term jolt to the system threw it into crisis mode for 18 months. And I would just finish up by putting out this quote from Herodotus, and this is one that's representative of many quotes of ancient Greek authors about this idea that the royal table comes to town, they're forced to supply it, and it leaves destruction in its wake, right? And you can, of course, say that you can use problems with Greek ideas of Persian decadence and richness and that sort of thing. Certainly all those problems exist in what we're seeing here, but we also see it throughout many Greek authors. And so what I would argue is that at least what we're seeing in part here is what the reactions to supplying the royal demands look like as they play out on the ground, and as a large institution like the AYANA tries to recover from a set of extraordinary demands on its economy over a period of a couple of years. Thank you.